He was humiliated and forced out of his seat, but just minutes later, the same flight attendant who shamed him was facing consequences no one could have predicted. What happened during this flight would change everything, not just for the people on board, but for the entire airline. James Walker, a 15-year-old boy with an air of quiet confidence, stepped onto the plane, clutching his boarding pass and a small backpack. He was dressed neatly in a college shirt and jeans, his sneakers spotless. He offered polite smiles to the crew as he made his way to his seat in the first-class section. His father, who had booked the ticket, had insisted James travel in comfort, knowing how hard the boy had worked at school and wanting to reward him with a memorable trip. James found his seat, stowed his bag, and settled in with a book. He loved flying. It always felt like an adventure. But his excitement dimmed slightly when Linda Harper, one of the flight attendants, appeared. Linda was in her late 50s, her sharp eyes scanning the first-class cabin with an air of judgment honed by years of service. Her crisp uniform and no-nonsense demeanor projected authority, but there was an edge to her that hinted at something darker. Her gaze fell on James, and she paused. Something about him, his youth, his quiet confidence, his presence in first class, seemed to unsettle her. She frowned slightly and approached him, her voice clipped. "Excuse me, young man, can I see your boarding pass?" James looked up, startled but polite. "Sure," he said, handing her the pass. Linda studied it, her frown deepening. "This seat is in first class," she stated, her tone laced with doubt. "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his voice steady. "My dad booked it for me." Linda's lips tightened. "I see." She handed the pass back, but lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing. Without another word, she turned and walked away, but her stiff posture suggested she wasn't finished with the matter. James returned to his book, trying to shrug off the strange interaction. He wasn't used to people questioning his presence in certain places, but he had learned to stay polite and composed. His dad often reminded him, "Stay calm, son. The world's not always fair, but your strength is in how you handle it." Moments later, Linda returned, her expression even colder than before. "Young man," she said, her tone sharper this time, "there seems to be a problem with your ticket. Could you come with me for a moment?" James blinked in surprise. "A problem? I thought everything was fine." "I just need to verify something," Linda replied, her voice curt. "Follow me." James hesitated, sensing the tension in her demeanor. He nodded reluctantly, grabbed his backpack, and stood. Linda turned on her heel and led him toward the galley, her pace brisk. The other passengers in first class glanced up from their seats, murmuring as they watched the interaction. James could feel their stares, but kept his head high. When they reached the galley, Linda folded her arms and fixed James with a hard look. "This seat isn't appropriate for you," she said flatly. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." James stared at her, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Why? My ticket is valid. I'm supposed to be in 3A. Linda's tone turned icy. "I've checked, and there must have been a mistake. This section is for passengers who belong here. You'll be more comfortable in the main cabin." The implication in her words hit James like a slap. He had done nothing wrong, but Linda's tone and expression told him everything he needed to know. He straightened his posture, refusing to let her see how much her words stung. "If my ticket is valid, why should I move?" Linda's face hardened. "Because I said so. Either you move now, or I'll call security to assist." James exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he said quietly. He didn't want a scene. He had learned long ago that standing up for himself could sometimes make things worse. He followed Linda back through the cabin, his head held high despite the whispers and glances of the other passengers. She led him to a middle seat in the economy section, where the seats were cramped and the overhead bins were already stuffed full. James sat down, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. He gazed out the window, his hands resting in his lap, but inside his mind was racing. He pulled out his phone, typing a quick message to his father. "They moved me to economy. Said my seat wasn't valid. Can you check?" When he hit send, he sat back and closed his eyes, trying to push down the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Linda returned to the first-class cabin, her expression smug. She handed out drinks and checked on other passengers, feeling a sense of satisfaction. But her confidence began to waver when Dennis, the senior flight attendant, approached her in the galley. "What's going on with the kid you moved?" Dennis asked, his tone neutral but curious. Linda shrugged, feigning indifference. "There was an issue with his ticket." Dennis frowned. "What kind of issue?" Linda hesitated, avoiding his gaze. "I just had a feeling he didn't belong there." Dennis's expression darkened. "A feeling? That's not how we do things, Linda. If his ticket was valid, you had no right to move him." Before Linda could respond, the galley phone buzzed. Dennis answered it, his brow furrowing as he listened. "It's for you," he said, handing the phone to Linda. "They're asking for you by name." Linda's stomach churned as she took the phone. "This is Linda," she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline executive office. We've received a complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. Ensure all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from further actions without proper justification. You'll need to provide a full report upon landing." Linda's face turned pale. "Yes, of course," she stammered. She hung up and turned to Dennis, who was watching her closely. "You made a mistake, didn't you?" Dennis asked quietly. Linda didn't answer, but the unease on her face was unmistakable. In the economy cabin, James's phone buzzed. It was a message from his father. "I'm on it. Sit tight." James smiled faintly, a flicker of relief washing over him. His dad was a lawyer, and if there was one thing he taught James, it was that fairness mattered. James leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window. He knew this wasn't over. As the plane continued its flight, Linda couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Each time she glanced toward the back of the plane, she saw James sitting calmly, his expression unreadable. The air between them seemed charged, and Linda began to realize she had underestimated him. When the plane began its descent, Linda received another call from the cockpit. The captain's voice was firm. "Linda, I've been informed that the boy you moved is James Walker. He's connected to the airline's board. You'll need to prepare a full report and personally address the situation before disembarkation." Linda felt the blood drain from her face. She had assumed James was just another teenager out of place. Now she realized she had made a grave error. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, James waited until the aisle was clear before standing. He gathered his belongings and walked toward the exit, where Linda stood with a forced smile. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her voice faltering. James met her gaze, his expression calm but piercing. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," he replied smoothly, before stepping off the plane. Minutes later, Linda was approached by two uniformed security officers. "Miss Harper?" one of them asked. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident on this flight," the officer said. "Please come with us." As Linda followed them off the plane, her mind raced. For the first time, she began to grasp the full weight of her actions. Meanwhile, James stood near the baggage claim, speaking quietly into his phone. "Dad, it's handled," he said. "Thanks for making the call." He grabbed his suitcase and walked toward the terminal exit, his steps steady and purposeful. He knew that what happened on the flight wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else would face the same kind of humiliation, and he was determined to make that happen.